We often think of childhood as a time in our lives when we are taken care of, fed, and provided with protection and safety. We learn to walk and talk, and eventually become educated to become contributing members of society. But not all children were lucky enough to grow up with these conditions. Feral children, also called wild children, are children who have grown up with limited human contact. Either by accident or deliberately, they have been isolated from human contact from a very young age, and so they have had little or no experience with human care, loving, or social behavior, or human language. Early descriptions of these children included non-human qualities, such as running on all fours, foraging and hunting for food, and absence of language. In this video, we will take a look at some of the accounts of feral children. One of the earliest accounts of a feral child was about Genie of Liege. Genie supposedly spent most of his youth in isolation in the Belgian wilderness. He first fled to the woods at the age of 5 to escape enemy soldiers during a religious war. After the danger had passed, his family and the rest of the village returned to their homes, but Genie was too scared to come out of hiding. He stayed in the forest where he survived for 16 years on roots and wild berries. At the age of 21, he was caught trying to steal food from a local farm. Genie returned to society, but he was reportedly naked and all overgrown with hair, and had forgotten the use of all language. Incredibly, his years in the woods had led him to develop a dog-like sense of smell, and he was able to sniff out food from great distances. Genie eventually began talking again, and his heightened senses dulled. Once he was back in civilization. The most widely known feral child of the early 18th century was Peter the Wild Boy. The naked and mute child was found near Hanover in 1725. He was brought before British King George I, who liked him, and he was regularly brought out to entertain royal guests at parties. Nobles adored Wild Boy's habit of running on all fours, his disregard for table manners, and his tendency to pick pockets and try to kiss ladies of the court. Attempts to civilize Peter failed. He never learned to speak. He hated wearing clothes and he preferred to sleep on the floor. He was eventually sent to the countryside where he lived until his death in 1785. He was buried in the cemetery of St. Mary's at Northchurch. Some believe that he was abandoned by his parents because they couldn't afford to raise him. Some researchers have speculated that he may have been abandoned to live in the woods because he suffered from Pitt-Hopkins syndrome, a rare neurological disorder characterized by distinctive facial features, learning disabilities, and an inability to develop speech. Another famous feral child of the 18th century was Marie-Angelique Memmie Blanc in France. She was known as the Wild Girl of Champagne, the Maid of Chalons, or the Wild Child of Sangy. In 1731, villagers in Sangy, France spotted a young girl dressed in animal skins and a tattered dress, and armed with a wooden club. It was hard for the villagers to tell how old she was. It could have been anywhere from 10 to 18 years old. She was astonishingly strong for her size. When the villagers sent a local guard dog her way, she killed it with one fatal blow and escaped into the woods. When the villagers eventually captured her, they discovered that she didn't speak any formal language and only communicated like an animal, with whoops, howling, and squeaks. She preferred to eat raw meat, often skinning and biting into the carcass of a fresh kill on the spot. When she knelt down to drink water, she repeatedly made sideway glances, the result of being in a state of constant alertness. She was baptized as Marie-Angelique Memmie Blanc, and in time she learned to speak French and grew more civilized and was sent to live in a convent. In interviews, she explained that she had escaped to the forest after being kidnapped and brought to Europe as an enslaved worker at the age of 7. It is believed that she was most likely a Native American of the Meskwaki people in what is now Wisconsin. Marie-Angelique amazed intellectuals and high society people in France as a former savage who had become refined. She learned to read, write, and speak French fluently. She mingled with nobility and was given a generous allowance by a duke and permitted to explore Europe. When the duke died, she lost her financial source, but she was soon able to secure other patrons due to her numerous wealthy connections. By the time she died in 1775 in Paris at the age of 63, she was quite wealthy herself. Victor was a boy around 12 years old that was found wandering in the forest near Aveyron, France in 1800. He was naked and mute, and had a large amount of scars which seemed to indicate that he had been exposed to the elements since a very young age. He refused to be washed or touched, ignored human contact, and often exploded in violent outbursts. French officials deemed the child an imbecile, but Jean-Marc Gaspard, who was a consultant to a school for the deaf, viewed the boy as a body on which one could test whether human knowledge was constructed or inborn. Itard worked with the boy, whom he named Victor, for several years. He eventually got him to bathe, wear clothes, and even show signs of empathy. However, Victor was still unable to use language, and while Itard taught him to understand basic spoken questions and commands, Victor died at the age of 40 without ever having uttered a complete sentence. Another feral child from the 1800s was Dina Sanichar, who was often known as the Wolf Boy. He was first discovered in 1867 in a cave in Bulandshahr district in the Indian state of Uttar Pradesh. A band of hunters saw what they initially thought was a wild animal sleeping in a cave. They were shocked to discover a boy of around 6 years old living among a pack of wolves. The child appeared to have been living in the wilderness for most of his life and behaved like a wolf, walking on all fours and making wolf-like grunts and howls. The hunters took the boy to the Sikandra Mission Orphanage in Agra, where he was taken in and named Dina Sanichar. Even though he was no longer with the animals, he still displayed animal-like behavior. Dina would only accept raw meat as food and gnawed on bones. The missionaries tried to teach him sign language by pointing, but this proved to be fruitless. Dina was able to make some progress, though, at the orphanage. He learned how to walk upright, put his own clothes on, and eat from a plate. Perhaps the most human habit that he learned was smoking cigarettes. Despite trying to adapt to human behavior, Dina never learned to talk nor fully adjusted to life among people. He died in 1895 of tuberculosis at the age of 35. When Marcos Rodriguez Pantoja was 6 or 7 years old, his father sold him to a farmer. Marcos was then instructed to help an old goat herd in the Sierra Morena mountains of Spain. Eventually, the goat herd died, leaving Marcos on his own. Since Marcos had grown up with an abusive stepmother at home, he did not want to go back and instead chose to stay in the mountains of southern Spain by himself. He spent the next 12 years of his life surrounded by wolves and other animals like goats, bears, and snakes. He found natural shelter inside a cave where wolves offered him food and animals guided him on what to eat. Whatever they ate, he ate. Luckily, the goat herd had taught Marcos how to hunt rabbits and build traps out of sticks and leaves before he died. This knowledge helped Marcos when there weren't animals around to teach him how to go after food. Marcos eventually learned to communicate with the animals by using growls and other sounds instead of words. In 1965, he was found at the age of 19 by the Guardia Civil, a law enforcement agency in Spain, who took him by force to the village of Fuencaliente. Nuns at a nearby hospital, along with a priest, taught Marcos again the use of speech, how to dress, walk upright, and eat with cutlery. He eventually was reintroduced as an adult to life in society. Spanish anthropologist and writer Gabriel Janer Manila wrote a thesis about Marcos's case, which he titled, "I Have Played with Wolves." Marcos's story was depicted in the 2010 Spanish-German film Among Wolves, in which he appears briefly. Marcos is frequently invited by organizations to give talks about his experience. He also has been interviewed in numerous television programs. In a March 2018 interview, Marcos said that he was disappointed in human nature and wished he could return to the mountains and leave society. The story of Marina Chapman is one of the more remarkable stories of feral children. Marina claimed to have lived with capuchin monkeys in the Colombian jungle from the age of 5 to about 9. She was kidnapped in about 1954, but then was abandoned in the jungles of Colombia. She began following the roaming family of monkeys around, and they soon accepted her as one of them. The animals taught Marina how to survive and take care of herself. Marina lived with the monkeys for about 5 years. At the age of 9, she was found by hunters, captured, and sold to a brothel in a nearby town. At this point, she had no human language. She ran away from the brothel and lived on the streets. She then became a slave to a mafia family. A neighbor rescued Marina and sent her to live with her daughter in Bogotá. The neighbor's daughter eventually adopted Marina. In 1977, the family sent their children to Bradford, Yorkshire in the UK with Marina to be their nanny. Marina eventually met her husband and established a family in Bradford. Marina and her younger daughter co-authored a book called The Girl with No Name, which recounts her life experiences. Genie is the pseudonym given to a feral girl that was born in 1957 in Los Angeles. She was the victim of severe abuse, neglect, and social isolation. For 13 years, Genie was confined to one room without external stimulation of any kind. She was strapped to a toddler toilet and was restrained in a makeshift harness for up to 13 hours per day. Sometimes she was even placed in an actual cage. It was believed her father, Clark Wiley, would beat her with a wooden plank if Genie vocalized at all, and that he would occasionally growl outside her door. Her father forbade anyone to interact with her, provided her with no stimulation of any kind, and left her severely malnourished. This isolation prevented Genie from being exposed to any significant amount of speech, and led to her not acquiring language during her childhood. Genie had almost no interaction with anyone but her immediate family, and was never allowed outside until she and her mother Irene escaped the home in 1970. Irene was nearly blind and claimed that her disability prevented her from helping Genie while she was being abused. Shortly after fleeing the home, Irene accidentally walked into a Los Angeles social services office instead of an office that offered aid to the blind. Welfare workers knew immediately that Genie was in need of their help. Child abuse cases were opened against both of Genie's parents. Irene claimed she was also a victim and was able to convince authorities to drop the case against her. Clark committed suicide before a scheduled court appearance on child abuse charges. From 1971 to 1975, Genie was subjected to scientific experimentation at the request of researchers at the National Institute of Mental Health. Throughout the time, scientists studied Genie. She made substantial advances in her overall mental and psychological development, including developing exceptional nonverbal communication skills, learning some basic social skills, and learning and using new language skills. However, by the end of their study, Genie still exhibited many behaviors of an unsocialized person and was unable to fully acquire a first language. Genie's living situation was mostly unstable. She was initially admitted to the Children's Hospital Los Angeles, where a team of doctors and psychologists managed her care for several months. She then left the hospital to live with her teacher, but a month and a half later, authorities placed her with the family of the scientist heading the research team. Genie lived with the family for almost 4 years. Soon after turning 18, she returned to live with her mother, but her mother decided after a few months that she could not adequately care for Genie. Genie was then moved through a series of institutions and foster homes for disabled adults. Some of the foster homes she was placed in were abusive. These experiences caused her physical and mental health to severely deteriorate and her newly acquired language and behavioral skills to regress, and she never recovered from the trauma even when she was removed from the homes. In early January 1978, Genie's mother abruptly forbade all scientific observations and testing of her. As of 2016, Genie is a ward of the state of California. She is reportedly in an assisted living facility in Los Angeles and is believed to be a mere shell of a person. Sujit Kumar was named the chicken boy of Fiji by the media and has never learned to speak and is only learning to behave like a human. His mother committed suicide when he was a toddler and his father was murdered. It is believed Sujit was put out with the chickens and locked in a chicken coop before he was 2 years old. Neighbors reported seeing him, but nothing was done until he was 8. After being found in the middle of the road one night clucking and flapping, he was taken to the Ssebunya old people's home by welfare officers. Sujit pecked at his food, crouched on a chair as if roosting, and would make clicking noises with his tongue. His fingers turned inward from scratching around in the dirt, and he seemed detached from what goes on around him. Sujit was confined to his room and tied to his bed because he was aggressive. No one knew what to do with a young man who did not speak and exhibited the behavior of a chicken. Sujit remained tied up at the old people's home for 20 years until he was found by Elizabeth Clayton, a wealthy Australian businesswoman. Elizabeth founded the Happy Home Trust to care for Sujit and other at-risk Fijian children. Sujit's behavior has improved, but it is assumed that he will never learn to speak, and he remains profoundly disabled. John Ssebunya was from Uganda and was 3 years old when his father killed his mother and hanged himself. John ran away to the jungle and lived with monkeys. When he was 6 years old, he was found by a Ugandan villager and brought back to his village. While he was living with the monkeys, John developed characteristics and traits of them. His knees were white from walking on them, and his nails were long and round. He ate roots, nuts, and sweet potatoes, and had developed a severe case of intestinal worms. The only forms of communication John was capable of were crying, screaming, and biting. Not only did John act like a monkey, he also had long hair that covered his face and body, but once it was shaved, the hair did not come back. After John was rescued, he eventually learned how to speak. It was soon discovered that he was a very good singer, and he ended up touring in the UK with the Pearl of Africa Children's Choir. John experienced delayed mental development, but he was incredibly athletic. In 1999, he ran a marathon, and in 2003, he was captain of Uganda's Special Olympic soccer team. Oxana Malaya was a Ukrainian girl who was found in a kennel with dogs in 1991. Her parents were alcoholics who neglected her and abandoned her outside. Looking for comfort, Oxana crawled into a dog kennel and lived with the dogs. Oxana was 8 years old when she was found, and her behavior imitated dogs more than humans. She walked on all fours, bared her teeth, and barked. She panted and sniffed at her food before eating it. She did not know any words other than yes and no. As a ward of the state, Oxana was admitted to several psychiatric institutes and group homes. She eventually learned how to talk again and also how to walk upright. Now an adult, Oxana has been taught to subdue her dog-like behavior. She works with farm animals, but remains somewhat intellectually impaired. She still requires supervision at an adult care facility and will likely never be fully independent. Ivan Mishukov was born in 1992 in Roytov, Russia, and ran away from home when he was 4 years old to escape his mother's alcoholic and abusive boyfriend. He begged on the streets and developed a relationship with a pack of wild dogs by sharing the food he got with them. The dogs grew to trust him, and in return the dogs protected him. He eventually rose to become the leader of the pack. When the police rescued him in 1998 at the age of 6, it took several tries as the dogs were very protective and wouldn't let anyone near Ivan. Ivan was placed in an orphanage near Moscow, and he was taken in by his foster mother. Since Ivan had only lived with the dogs for 2 years, he relearned language quite quickly. He studied in military school and served in the Russian army. He later found a full-time factory job and now lives a normal life. Dubbed Dog Boy by the Chilean media, a 10-year-old Chilean boy who had been abandoned by his parents at the age of 5 was rescued after living with street dogs for 2 years. Dog Boy had escaped from a care center and lived in a cave with dogs. He roamed the streets and looked for food with them, eating out of garbage cans and finding leftovers. When police found him in 2001, he tried to escape by jumping into the ocean. A police officer jumped in and saved him. He was hospitalized for a day and then was taken to a child care center. The boy showed signs of depression and was aggressive, and did not speak much even though he could. It was reported that Dog Boy ran away from a children's home where he was being looked after a few months later. At the age of 4, Chhaidy and her cousin Bairaku went missing in a jungle near Siha, Mizoram, India, which is close to the border with Myanmar. The local communities worked to find the 2 young children. A day after the children went missing, there was a heavy rainstorm and many assumed the 2 4-year-olds would not survive. But 5 days later, Bairaku was found alive beside a stream, and there was hope that they could find Chhaidy, who was still missing. They searched for months, but there was no trace of Chhaidy, and they gave up hope that they would see her again. 38 years later, in 2012, a resident of nearby Myanmar came to visit a relative in the village where Chhaidy's family lived. The visitor told Chhaidy's father that he resembled a woman she adopted 4 years ago. They had found her living in their village cemetery. She was almost naked, had long hair and fingernails, had wild mannerisms, and was incomprehensible. Chhaidy's father decided to go see the woman. He at first didn't recognize her, but eventually identified her as his long-lost daughter from her birthmark. The family finally managed to take Chhaidy back home to India. Since returning home, Chhaidy has received no medical or psychological attention. For someone who lived in the jungle for almost all her life, Chhaidy is very human-like. She can only speak a few words, but is learning new words and skills every day. She helps her mother in the kitchen and performs a number of household jobs. Although very childlike, Chhaidy is not shy of human interaction and roams around the village, moving from neighbor to neighbor, playing with anyone who seems interested. The consequences for feral children vary, and their capabilities when they are found and how much they are able to adapt back to the world can be very different. They will continue to provide interesting insight into human development.